I'm Carla Sosenko. I'm editor-in-chief of Us Weekly magazine. I am so grateful to see all of you, especially on this oppressively hot day. There's nothing better than to watch a movie on a hot day, although this one probably wasn't necessarily a calming or relaxing watch so much as an insightful one. I am beyond honored to welcome the following people to the stage. First and foremost, Katharine Gun. Director Gavin Hood. And journalist Martin Bright. It's very hard to know where to start because I'm sure, I have a million questions and I kind of want to just throw them all at you at once, and I'm sure you guys do too. So I think maybe the best place to start would be, Gavin, to ask you how you decided to do this film, how it kind of came about and developed, and how we came to have Official Secrets.
I decided to do this film because of these two people who I met. I'm slightly ashamed to say that my producer, Jed Doherty, on a film called Eye in the Sky, which we'd done before this, called me up. We were looking for something else to do, and he called me up and he said, "Have you ever heard of Katharine Gun?" And I felt I ought to have, because the tone of his voice suggested that somebody you should know. And that was a little awkward, so I had to say no. And turns out many of us had not heard of Katharine. And he said, well, just Google her, Google the Official Secrets Act, and call me back. A few hours later, diving into the internet, I called him back and I said, I'd love to meet Katharine. And cutting a long story short, went to London. We met, spent 5 days together. I asked her to start at the beginning and just tell me her whole story. And then I met Martin and spent many, many days with Martin. And Martin introduced me to Ed Vulliamy and Peter Beaumont and ultimately Ben Emerson, played by Ralph Fiennes. And I guess after about a month, I went back to Los Angeles and started to work on a new version. There had been a script before, and I started to work on this particular version of the film. And there we are.
Here we are. Katharine, so your story, which is, of course, the focal point of this unbelievable film. So one thing for me, the first time you're called a spy in the film, I was like, well, yeah, I guess she is a spy. You know, we tend to think of spies as these shadowy figures who kind of, roam through alleys and we never see them. And you were going to an office every day, but you were a spy. And so I would love to know, how did you end up in that line of work? Just a little bit of your background and how you came to be in the position that you were in.
Okay. Well, I grew up in Taiwan. So my parents went out there when I was about 3 years old. And I learned Mandarin Chinese the easy way as a child. And then eventually I ended up, graduating from university and wanting to, decide what to do with my life. And I saw an advert in, I think it was the Guardian newspaper, of all papers, yes, advertising GCHQ post. They wanted Mandarin speakers, Arabic speakers, and so on. And I thought, oh, interesting, because I wasn't really interested in the business world. I'm not business-minded. I'm not interested in finance or anything like that. So. I thought, well, it sounds intriguing. I don't know much about it, so I'll apply. And that's how I ended up at GCHQ.
When you get the email, I would have imagined that those kinds of things were coming to you all the time, left and right, that you're getting kind of, shady things that you might have, shady might be the wrong word, but that you have a strong reaction to. Is that email that you got that set off the chain of events in the film, was that the first time that had happened to you in your career?
Yeah, for me it was the first time. I mean, yes, there's a close working relationship between NSA and GCHQ. And, just not long before this email came out, I was actually in San Diego on a conference, which was all of the secret services, both sides of the Atlantic. So we were there in San Diego on a conference. So yeah, everybody works closely together. But this was different. In the routine course of my work, I didn't get kind of that direct sort of communication from NSA. But, this was specifically about targeting individuals with a purpose. The agenda was to use information that would be gathered illegally from them in order to win a vote which would authorize the invasion of a sovereign nation. And for me, that was crossing the line. It was totally unacceptable, and it was, had to be made public.
Martin, in terms of making things public, obviously this story was one for you that it seems like you felt you had to tell, that this was a story that you had to get out there. What was it about this particular story that made you so doggedly report it?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because you have to realize that in a busy newsroom like that, this was not the only story I was working on. I looked back recently and saw that I did 4 other stories that week. I was the Home Affairs editor, so I covered police, prisons, everything that was to do with Home Affairs, as it's called. And so I did write about prisons that week. I wrote about immigration that week. This was just one of several stories in a busy newsroom. But there was something about this story that got to me. I knew from the moment I saw the memo when it was given to me by Yvonne Ridley, the journalist you see in the hijab in the movie, that this was potentially a huge story. Although, of course, at that stage it was immensely frustrating, because it was as Matt Smith says in the film, it was just some words typed on a piece of paper. It could have been anyone. But I had a feeling that this was something potentially huge. And I suppose it was just the fact that we were being given one particular narrative by government, and this seemed to be directly in contradiction of what our politicians were telling us. And that's always, at the heart of a great story, is that you're holding politicians to account and catching them out in lies.
So you mentioned the newsroom, and I would say that one of the, strangely, in a film about illegal government actions and illegal war, espionage, all of it, one of the most dramatic moments happens in the newsroom about spell check.
Yes.
So, Gavin, I know that you've said you didn't want to inject or kind of overlay the story with any sort of fictional poetry, or I think
That's
you said
okay.
it
No,
better than I'm saying
I
it.
think you're saying it better than
Oh,
me.
okay, all right.
Fictional poetry. I wouldn't have
Yeah,
come up with
that's
that.
good. It's pretty good.
I'm going to steal that.
As opposed to nonfiction poetry.
Non-fictional poetry is much better.
But did that happen?
Okay, so that really happened, just like that. That really happened. You can look her up, Nicole Mowbray. She's seen the movie. She's a lovely person. She's still a journalist.
It was her first week at the Observer.
It was her first week.
Oh my God.
And she just said to me, Gavin, oh God, are you really making this film? Oh God, that was the worst day of my life. Poor young thing, And she did something quite routine, right? She spell-checked an article.
Yeah, I mean, it was
So
a
yes,
bad
it really
moment.
happened.
I mean, it really was a bad moment. It was.
It really was a bad moment. No kidding.
No kidding. And there was that terrible moment where we were by that stage pretty sure that it was what it seemed. We were pretty sure it wasn't a sophisticated Russian forgery or a piece of propaganda, or have the conversation with the admiral in the gentleman's club in London, where I overthink it, as he says, and. We were pretty sure by that stage, but you always have a little tiny edge of doubt in these situations, and so when the Drudge Report suggested that we'd been duped, it was pretty bad. So that I can still remember going to the office and opening up that drawer and the immense sense of relief when I realised it was in American spelling. But then, of course, we had to find out who'd done it. Someone had to blow the whistle.
Give her a nice cup of tea.
Yes.
So British.
So Martin and Katharine, we're in a room full of actors. What was it like working with Keira Knightley and Matt Smith as they prepared to portray you? I think I would love to hear what that process was like for you, and also what the emotional journey was like for you.
I think it was very different for both of us. I mean, Katharine, you should probably talk first
Okay.
about Keira.
Okay, well, of course. I mean, beyond my wildest dreams, right, to have Keira Knightley play me. I was obviously terrified when she wanted to meet me, but I was also pleased. And so Gavin came with her to have lunch with me in London just before they started shooting. And I was sat there pretending to look cool, reading the newspaper, waiting for her to come in. And then when she comes in, she just, she's dressed casually and looks at me and smiles and says, "Hey, Katharine," and gives me a hug. So that immediately put me at ease. And, she's also mother, so we sat down and we started chatting about motherhood. And but before long, we got into the kind of ins and outs of the story, and she asked really intelligent questions. She'd obviously done her research, and she was really on the ball, and I was very impressed. Yeah, I mean, that also was a moment of relief for me because, at first I thought, well, she's done all these costume dramas and, but no, she's a sharp cookie.
Yeah.
So, and then I went to see some of the filming. I saw one day, my family and we went to see the actual GCHQ scene where she's, looking at the memo and when she's deciding to leak it.
Was that surreal? What was that like?
Yeah, it was surreal, but in a way it was because the actual setting is slightly different. I don't know, it was kind of like watching somebody else. And I've said that now, thinking about it, it's like watching somebody else's story that's very similar to my own. So there's just this slight distance in it that is easier to deal with. The only thing that for me was a real tearjerker when I actually watched the film in the San Francisco festival was in fact the scenes of shock of war over Iraq. That was the most emotional moment for me. Yeah.
Yeah, it was slightly different for me because I knew Matt Smith from I'd worked as a consultant on a previous project of his called Party Animals, which was a TV series about parliamentary researchers in London. It was his first big break, in fact, along with another British actress called Andrea Riseborough, who went on to bigger and better things. It was a great series, and so when they were casting around for people to play me, I had this rather peculiar experience of being asked by the producers to contact Matt. And so there is somewhere in his phone, there's a text saying, Matt, got a slightly strange request. How would you like to play me? He took a very different approach, in fact. We had some early conversations. He wanted some notes about me, and I explained that I really wasn't like him. He was the head boy of his school. He's quite posh, posher than me. He's played Prince Philip hilariously, and I said, you really have to. And he'd played Doctor Who, the big character in British. And I had to explain that as a journalist, you're not like that. You're not really like that.
Not Prince Philip.
You are, you're the boy at the back of the class. You're the, it's a kind of sneaky profession. You've got to have rat-like cunning, and And you could see him sort of taking this on board and thinking, oh my God, what have I done? And in fact, on the first day of shooting, when I was advising on the newsroom scenes, he did initially try to kind of impersonate me and try to be like really sneaky. And Gavin had to sort of say, Matt, don't do that. And actually, once he'd relaxed into himself, he was just wonderful. And I think there were what I noticed on set is there were kind of two kinds of actors, weren't there? There were some who did brilliant impersonations. So Roger Alton,
Conleth Hill plays him.
Conleth Hill from Game of Thrones plays him. Absolutely, he really is like that. The
editor, the
sweary kind of
the one who swears endlessly,
editor.
and the only critique from Ed Vulliamy is that he swore much more in real life
that's right.
than in the movie.
and Rhys Ifans, who plays Ed Vulliamy, spot on, absolutely brilliant impersonation. I think Gavin will talk about the demands that Ed made about that particular part. But then there were other actors who did it in a completely different way. Just they were not impersonating; they were using themselves. And I think probably Keira and Matt fall into that camp. They weren't trying to do impersonations.
Well, I mean, speaking to a room full of actors as an actor myself, let's start with Keira. We went through the possible impersonation route, and of course, if you can do both, like if you're Helen Mirren playing, or you know, the Queen, or if you're Meryl Streep playing Margaret Thatcher, you kind of have to nail the look and everything else and every mannerism because they are such iconic, and no offense, Kev. Oops. I'll just crawl out from behind my rock. They are particularly well known, and you were a secret spy. Next one. But anyway.
She's iconic now.
She's iconic now. Yeah. Now she's iconic. The point was that Keira, you know, we looked at should she go more blonde? Should we go? And of course, that was my initial instinct. And there's no right answer to this. But one day, Keira came into rehearsal and she said, Gavin, the more I feel I have to mimic, the harder I feel I'm feeling, the harder it is for me to just feel what it must have felt like to be her in those moments. And let's get the right wardrobe, but I just don't want to go in makeup. I don't want to change my face, my nose, my glasses, my hair. I just want to go with no makeup. I'm done with corsets. She literally said, I just want to get in and out of makeup and wardrobe as quickly as possible and just focus on what it must feel like moment to moment to be in her shoes. And let me rather imagine myself as Keira Knightley in her circumstances, rather than attempting to see if I can best impersonate Katharine Gun, who is not someone you can go and watch umpteen newsreels of on the way you can with the Queen or the way you can. And I think that was the right choice, because what it did is it just moved any kind of looking at yourself. She just was being her most raw and vulnerable self, experiencing the beats that the character experienced and bringing an incredible honesty from within to that role. And I think she embodies Katharine beautifully rather than impersonates Katharine. But this is an interesting question for actors. And I think Matt, once I got him to that, because initially he was feeling an obligation to impersonate.
I was in the room. It was really...
and he was in the room, and Matt's brilliant. And Matt, the one thing that Matt decided with the rat-like cunning was to sort of peer out from underneath. And sometimes I've had to go to Matt and go, Matt, I can't see into your eyes. You're such a rat-like cunning fellow, I can't even see what you're doing. It's great talking to actors. You see how different this Q&A is? It's great. Oh, we've had all these serious journalists digging into the history of the Iraq War, and now we're talking about rat-like cunning.
Bloody whistleblower.
Oh, it's lovely. Yeah. This is so fun, finally. Oh, God. So I would go, one day I go, Matt, the camera's here and you're cunning. Anyway, but he is, again, a lovely, lovely human being who is just bent on trying to find an honesty to the moment. There's nothing egotistical about him. There's just a genuine hunt for an emotional truth. And once we said, that's all I care about. Matt. You're wearing the right clothes. The wardrobe is on. You know, the haircut is great. Let's just forget about all that. Not that he ever cared about the haircut, but I'm just saying, no impersonating. You look sufficiently like Martin Bright. Let's just work on the feeling again of what it must be like to, for example, spell check. And he, you know, he's just lovely. Both he and Keira bring themselves. Because what else do we have as actors, right? You know, the best thing I would say is, you know, many of you probably trained in the method, and some of you classically trained. And I've been through all those, and what I land when I'm working with actors is one little place, you know. What if this were happening to you? You guys have a sufficient imagination. I hope I'm not being condescending to a great many experienced people, but what if this were happening to you? As opposed to, it is happening to me, but it never happened to me, and it happened to my grandmother. It didn't. Get it out of here. You know, we've all been there, right? My granny's dying. Who died? My dog. You're thinking about the goddamn dog. What if Granny died? Or what if you'd put out this memo and then the spell check happened? So you know, because also when you're working on a film, you have to work at a certain speed. So you need to be able to find that what if moment pretty quickly.
I also thought, I have to say, I also thought that some of the smaller characters were great. Yeah, you know, there are some fabulous performances of the smaller roles.
Brilliant, the detective from Scotland. I'm sorry for interrupting.
Okay, go ahead.
He was great. He was great.
Masks the interrogator. Before they even spoke, you knew. Damn, that's a good choice in casting.
Thank you. No, he's asking about the minor roles. I mean, one of the things I really enjoy, and it's a little selfish, is the casting process. So you guys probably know better than me, because as a director, I don't get to see how other people cast. I do remember being a young actor and feeling there were sometimes I went into a room and I felt like they're all sitting there with their arms folded waiting for me to fail, you know, and you feel this tremendous pressure and everyone said, oh, next please, and it's all. I work in a slightly different way. I want you to succeed because that's good for me, and I tend to try and have slightly longer auditions. You know, my people say, well, you need 10 minutes. Like, 10 minutes? I can't do anything in 10 minutes. They're going to come and read the lines and leave. I need 20, half an hour. You need time, because we do come in nervous, and you want the moment to break that. And so I tend to read the lines with the actors in the audition to try and just loosen it up. And then you're looking to just find somebody who, again, brings themselves to that moment. So I think what helps me in the rehearsal, in the casting process, it's actually, in a way, you guys are helping me test the lines. You know, if the scene's not working, it might not be your fault. It could be my writing. So it's a really special time, and every little part. Here's why I think, in whatever part you're doing, why every part matters is because for the moment that camera is on the face of someone, however small the part, they are the lead. We're watching them. You drop the ball, the film's moving along in a continuum, right? You have a bad performance moment, the audience feels it, they dip, now I've got to win them back. So it is important to me that I give the time to the person who's just patting Katharine down at the end. I think that security guard is phenomenal, the way she says, arms out, stretch, all right, judge will see you now. I mean, it's a great performance, and it's only a couple of lines, but we worked that performance, and she is a wonderful actress. Anyway, I'm speaking way too much because I love talking to actors, but thank you.
I don't think anybody minded.
No, it's okay. Can't really see them in the dark, but they see me, right?
They're okay. They're good. So, not that filmmakers, or certainly the real-life counterparts to characters on screen, have so much control over timing, but I am curious about what it means for this film to be released right now, because we were talking about this for a moment in the green room. You know, in the United States and certainly in Great Britain and in lots of other places, we're at a very, I don't even know how to describe the political situation across the world or in this country right now. But for me, and maybe for some of you, it was really strange to be watching those news clips that you mentioned and be back in it and be reminded of how we felt then, you know, wherever you came down on the political spectrum, wherever you came down on the war, for a lot of us, you know, it was just like, oh my God, that's right. We kind of, we've gotten to a place where we're in such a different place politically and in terms of decorum or whatever else you want to call it. Is there anything in particular that, are you hoping, art certainly doesn't need to instruct or do anything other than be great art, but are you hoping that this film will do something at this particular moment? Is there a reason that it's being released right now?
Well, I'll just quickly answer the reason, because I love these guys. But the reason is no. The reason is it took 3 years to make, and Katharine had various versions, and Martin for 5 years before that, and finally you get the money, and it's very hard to raise money on these kinds of films. And so in some ways I think the timing is, it's a horrible word to use, fortuitous perhaps, because it is something from 20 years ago. But maybe we would have felt that way last year too, because there's something timeless about a story that at its heart, and why I liked it, and again, I hope Katharine will forgive me. On the one hand, it's got this big political canvas, but on the other hand, it's just a story about an ordinary person doing something extraordinary. And what I was drawn to was, and I hope for you guys, watching Katharine's story as I worked on it and so on, I kept asking myself, would I have the courage to do this? Now, not necessarily as a spy, but many people work in organizations, accounting firms, law firms, Enron, Boeing. Wherever you work, there's a moment for some people, for many of us, where something comes across your desk that's not quite right. And it's a hell of a thing to sort of stick your head above the parapet at the risk of losing your job and say, boss, I'm not comfortable with this. And she risked not only losing her job, but her freedom. So if that's a story that's timeless and resonates in this time, what we see in the administration, when do you speak up? I'd like these guys to talk, because Martin speaks very eloquently about the post-truth world, and talk about your feelings about Bush and Blair in the world where truth sort of mattered, and then...
Yeah, well, what a setup. I better speak eloquently now. Yeah. This means a lot for us now, I think. This film is both, to my mind, a great film and a fine work of art, but it is also a fine piece of journalism in itself. This story is not over. There are lots of loose ends that where we still don't know the answers. We don't know who authorized that operation from the American side. We don't know who authorized it, or indeed whether it was authorized from the British side. We don't know really why the government in the UK dropped the charges. And so there are all sorts of ways that this story remains entirely current. But I think it also makes us ask questions about the way that we hold our politicians to account. Because, without wanting to be nostalgic about the Bush-Blair era, whatever their faults, when you were covering political stories during that period, you knew that it mattered to them if you caught them out in a lie. Now, they understood the difference between truth, lies, and propaganda. I'm absolutely sure about that. And they chose to cross those lines for one reason or another. But if you caught them out, it mattered. The problem we find now, both in Britain and the US, is that it doesn't really matter, because our politicians don't really care about being caught out in lies, and more to the point, they are prepared to say one thing one day and something completely contradictory the next. And that makes the job of journalists very, very difficult. Now, whether it's better that people know they're telling lies or misleading the public and do it anyway, or to be in a position where you have absolutely no idea what you're saying from one moment to the next, I don't know. But but I think we do find ourselves in a very different context. I believe that journalists doing their job find themselves, particularly in this country, in an extremely difficult situation. But it doesn't mean we should stop doing it.
That's it. What do you think?
Well, you've said everything so eloquently yourselves. But I think where we are now is a direct result of what began under Bush and Blair and the lies, and Martin has also talked about this himself, but undermining the institutions across the sector. And I think until we address those issues, it's not going to get any better. So instead of the kind of constant distractions, the bipartisan bickering and the distractions, and we have to go back to the fundamentals and do our jobs properly, whatever our jobs are. We have to do them to the best of our ability, and hopefully some magic will happen.
I think that's very interesting what Katharine says about just do your job, because sometimes it feels a bit overwhelming. Do we have to solve the world? Is the film supposed to change everything, which it won't? But what drew me to Katharine is, in a way, she's just, even though she's a spy, she was trying to be a good spy. Meaning, because I asked her at one point, it's the moment I was not sure I was going to do the film, and then decided I would. And it's in the movie, because the interrogator asked her too. It's the question of, Katharine, I hear all this, but you're a spy. You're in the world of dirty tricks. And, you work for the government. And she went, I don't work for the government. And that literally is still in my notes. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, governments change. What is the essence of my job? I have no problem, and I don't want to paraphrase for you, but you said to me that day, I have no problem dealing information that might help my country understand what the trade position might be, if the Chinese are planning something that gives my country an advantage in some way, and I have no problem gathering information that might help prevent a terror attack. What I object to is gathering information that my government, that is supposed to represent the people, will use to lie to the very people they represent. That's a line, and I thought, that's a very clear moral compass. That's not my job, and there's I hope I don't get too technical on this, but for those of you interested in sort of the way intelligence can work in two ways, the traditional model for CIA intelligence is called the social scientific method, but all it really means is the CIA is supposed to be walled off from politicians completely. The theory is that the intelligence comes in from various sources to the Central Intelligence Agency. Analysts analyze it. They do their best to try and understand what's going on and give what they perceive as the reality on the ground in whatever place it is to the executive. And the executive is not supposed to walk through that wall and say, no, I'd rather it was this kind of intelligence. They're supposed to be walled off. Now, this is where it got interesting in 2003, and feel free to Google this. Google the Office of Special Plans, the OSP, if you've never heard of them. There, I hear people who know about it. So what happened is, when Bush and his crew weren't getting the intelligence they wanted from the CIA in 2002 and 2003, they bypassed the CIA, as Rhys Ifans playing Ed Vulliamy says, and they created the Office of Special Plans. This is not a conspiracy. It's even on Wikipedia. It's not even deep dive you have to go. And the OSP was set up at the Pentagon with 8 so-called analysts under Wolfowitz and then under Doug Feith. How do I say? And then the person who was the director really implementing the policy was a man called Abram Shulsky. You can look him up. Draw a deep breath. Shulsky's comes from a Straussian school of intelligence thought, and the basic idea is he has been quoted as saying, the purpose of intelligence is not truth, but victory. Now hold that thought for a moment, because, and I'm glad you all gasped, because the purpose of intelligence is not truth, but victory. Well, that is true in the military intelligence world once you're at war and you're trying to win by whatever means. Drop propaganda leaflets, tell the Germans that they're going to be bombed tomorrow morning by thousands if they don't leave there. Whatever you do, that's the role of that intelligence officer, is to listen to his commander's plan and help achieve that goal by whatever means necessary. But that is the wrong, in my view, philosophy to have in a pre-war context where you're trying to make objective assessments when the goal in theory has not been set. And I say in theory because we now know that the decision to invade Iraq was made, months if not years before. So that's what happened in American intelligence world, which is why so many in the intelligence circles of our context, mine, and there are some really good intelligence officers who are really pissed off at that shift in philosophy. It's just sorry it was complicated, but it's a thought worth knowing.
No,
Look
I
up
think
the
it was
Office of Special Plans
fascinating.
if you're remotely interested. You'll read it in 10 minutes. It's interesting.
So I can't believe this, but we're out of time.
Oh man, we were just getting going. Do one more.
I don't think. Yeah, we can do it. We can do one more. Yes.
Thank you
Just got
so
the
much,
signal.
guys. This has been fun. Yeah.
We actually have some. Yes, we
Yeah,
have some
go.
audience questions. So this one is, Katharine. This is for you. Although, if you guys have anything to add, please do not hesitate. Can you talk about the process you went through to decide what to do? Did you know the road would be so difficult? And did you ever think it might not be worth the sacrifice?
Oh, good question. Well, yeah, at the time when I saw the memo, I was already very much concerned about what was happening. So as you could see in the film, Keira Knightley was, watching the news and keeping abreast of everything that was going on. So I went on the, anyway, yeah, so I was very concerned about what was going on. So when I saw the memo, it was like a red flag. It infuriated me. And so I couldn't think about anything else. It was like I had blinkers on and I was kind of just focused on getting this information out. And it was only after, it became apparent that when the memo was reproduced on the front pages of the Observer, that I couldn't actually deny it for much longer, and I couldn't continue to lie to other people that it wasn't me. So when I confessed, then it became apparent to me the consequences of my action. But no, I don't regret it. I hope I would still do it today. Yeah.
And Gavin, one last question for you. Do you find stories to adapt, get rights and write, or do others ask you to do it? How does work? And I guess that you've explained to us the process of this film, but in general.
Yeah, I don't want to bore you because I know but both. I mean, stories come from different places. I've written original work, I've collaborated, I've had a good script sent to me. It comes from many sources. But I do enjoy the writing process myself because it prepares me as a director, because when you're writing and you're researching and you're talking to these sort of wonderful, interesting people, it fuels you, It's like great prep to finally make the movie.
Yeah. Well, I can't thank you guys enough for coming. Martin Bright, Gavin Hood,
Thank
Katharine
you,
Gun.
guys. This was
Thank
a
you
great
all
screening.
for coming
Thank
out.
you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.